Good evening, and thank you all for being here. Welcome to our first WCD meeting via Zoom in these crazy economic times. My name is Paula Skjefte. For those of you who don't know me, I am the co-chair of the Minnesota chapter of WCD, along with Kathy Rodell and Cindy Brooks, who are also on the call. Thank you for joining us. We have over 60 members of WCD, some guests, and some Federal Reserve staff on the Zoom call this evening. Most importantly, we have the honor of having Neel Kashkari here to share his insights on the economic recovery. I will tell you that when we asked Neel to speak, it was over 9 months ago. It was during the longest bull market in recent history, and we had an inkling that perhaps the economy may start to change in 2020. We had no idea how timely the discussion would be in the midst of COVID-19, the economic crisis, the global response to the death of George Floyd. It's hard to read the news without the Fed being front and center in this conversation. I have a few logistics. Everyone is on mute for the session, so we can minimize any background noise. We're recording the session and it'll be available for replay. If you have any technical issues, you can email Kristen Ames. She sent you the meeting notice, and so you should all have her contact information. If you are having video problems, I do understand that Zoom has a new set of software and they may have required you to download it. So you can always just dial in to the password and then using the meeting ID and password. We have a very crisp agenda. Following my introduction of Neel will provide an overview of the Fed and give us a little grounding, since we all may have little different levels of understanding. And then we have, I will moderate questions that were sent in advance, and we will have a dialogue back and forth with Neel. And then we will take live questions as time permits. To submit live questions, you can do that anytime during this session. There is at the bottom of your screen a chat button, and you can just click that and submit questions, and we'll log those and integrate them as we can. So with that, I want to give Neel a proper formal introduction. Excuse me, I just need to grab one piece of paper in my lovely opportunity to have everything organized. His bio is no longer immediately in front of me.
Don't worry about it.
All right. I think I've rehearsed it so many times I can say it out loud without looking at it. So Neel is the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Fed Bank. He is the 13th president in this role. He is very involved in monetary policy at all levels. He is on the market committee in Washington and highly influential. Neel has an amazing background that started with being a rocket scientist, literally, with a bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Illinois, and he literally did work for NASA. That was prior to getting his MBA at Wharton and going into the areas of finance and public policy. When he was following graduate school, he went to Goldman Sachs and then to the Fed and worked for the US Treasury. Initially in Washington, DC, he led the TARP program in 2008 under both George Bush and Barack Obama. He had a brief stint in California, running for governor in 2014, and joined the Minneapolis Fed on June 1st, 2016. He has led a number of initiatives that are really focused on economic equality and stabilizing the economy. One of the recent contributions he's involved with is working with retired Supreme Court Justice Alan Page, and in focusing on social justice issues in education, and he'll tell us more about that later. He's also chartered a bill on too big to fail to really protect taxpayers from the economic burden of the large banks failing. We are just honored to have him. He is a busy man, as you can imagine, during these times. And we are thrilled to be able to have this meaningful conversation with him today. So with that, Neel, please feel free to add what I did not remember from my memory. And he will also give us a nice background and primer on the Fed.
Well, thank you, Paula. When I said don't worry about it, I didn't mean you have to try to go from memory. I meant you could just skip it, but you did a fantastic job. Probably better than I could have done. But thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for inviting me. It's great to be with you. I know many of your members. I only see a few on the screen right now, but hi everyone, and thanks for having me. I always like to start with just a few minutes about what the Federal Reserve is, because not everybody knows about it. You know about it, but the level of understanding is varied. So the Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank. We were created by Congress in 1913. The US has always had a history of being afraid of central banking. It started out, Europe had central banks, the Bank of England, but it just sounded very undemocratic, a bunch of bankers in a dark room doing God knows what. So when Congress finally said we need to have a central bank to manage the ups and downs of the economy, they did something unique. And they said, let's distribute the central bank out around the country so that all the regions of the country are directly represented in policymaking. So they created the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. You've probably heard of our chair, Jay Powell. Before him was Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan. They sit in Washington, D.C. And then there are 12 independent Federal Reserve banks scattered around the country, the 9th of which is here in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Fed. And we represent Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, part of Michigan, and part of Wisconsin. And a big part of our jobs is to travel around the region, to get to know what's happening in the local economy. It's a big region with a lot of variation, and bring that knowledge back to Washington, D.C., so that we can speak about and add that information to the policy process. Now, we set, Paula mentioned the Federal Open Market Committee, we set interest rates for the nation. It's how we try to manage the ups and downs of the U.S. economy. If the U.S. economy looks like it's slowing down, typically the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates to make it cheaper for a business to get a loan or for a family to get a mortgage, for example, to encourage more economic activity and more investment. Or if the economy looks like it's overheating, we'll do the opposite. We'll typically raise interest rates, which will make it more expensive to get a loan, and then slow down the economy that way. Well, we can only we have one interest rate for the whole nation because we all use the same dollar. So we can't set a different interest rate for Minnesota or a different interest rate for California or New York. So we have to make the best judgment we can for what's right for the country as a whole. But my job, a big part of my job, is to make sure that our region is represented in that process, and considerations of what's happening in our region are part of those deliberations. And so meetings like this are actually very helpful to me. The more they're two-way, the more they're a dialogue, the more I will learn from you about what you're seeing in the businesses, the companies that you are directors of. That'll make me smarter about what businesses in our region are seeing, and that can help me make better recommendations. Now, I'm not going to Washington. We're doing these all remotely now, the last few, and I expect we will for the near future at least. But the process is very robust, and there's a lot of input from around the country. So these meetings like this are actually a very good use of my time, and I really do appreciate it. And I do hope that we'll have an active, not just Q&A, but you also sharing with me things you may be seeing that I should hear about. Let me just spend a few minutes on COVID. None of us saw this coming. We run scenarios at both our staff in Minneapolis, our staff around the Federal Reserve System nationally, are always running scenarios of what could impact the US economy. We're looking at what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Asia, what's happening in financial markets. We run lots of scenario analyses. And in the scenario analysis a year ago was not pandemic hammers the global economy. So typically when these crises come, they come from areas that we're not looking for. And this is another great example of that. This was not on our radar a year ago, and yet here we are, the biggest economic event since the Great Depression, certainly in terms of what's happened to unemployment. Right now, in the last few months, we have all been spending a lot of time learning from and listening to the best health scientists in the world to understand where is the COVID crisis likely to go. It is the virus that is determining the economy, not the other way around. And right now, I'll just give you a snapshot of where I think we are right now. Right now, Minnesota is faring better than many states. right? We locked things down. Cases are now declining in Minnesota. Hospitalizations are declining. Admission to ICUs are declining, and deaths are declining. That's very good news. But if you look around the country, in many other states, that's not happening. In many other states, cases and hospitalizations and admissions to ICUs are climbing. And there's no way to physically isolate Minnesota from the rest of the country. And so my base case scenario is that for the country as a whole, we will have a second wave. Maybe we're beginning to see the second wave. It's hard to debate, is this just the first wave that's continuing, or is this in fact a second wave that's coming? The health experts tell us that today between 5 and 10% of Americans have been exposed to the virus. So if you assume for a moment that once you've been exposed to it and you recovered, let's just assume for a moment that you're now immune for some period of time. Let's say it's a year. We don't know that for a fact, but let's just say it's a year. Between 5 and 10% of Americans have been exposed to the virus so far. And the health experts say we need to get to 60 or 70% to achieve what's called herd immunity. So we have a long, long, long way to go before we get to herd immunity. And the virus is going to continue to spread until we get there. Now, what would be a great solution, of course, getting to herd immunity is a vaccine. That would be terrific. We could get to 60 or 70% being safe through a vaccine. That's ideal. But the best health experts all tell us that is a year to 18 months away. And even then, it is not a certainty that we will, in fact, have a vaccine. We want to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So my base case scenario, unfortunately, is that we will be living with this virus in some form for the near future, for the rest of this year, well into 2021. And the economic recovery as a result of that is likely going to be bumpy and more muted. When this thing first started in March, when it first really hit America in March, I think a bunch of us, myself included, were hopeful that maybe we could lock the economy down hard, really clamp down hard for 2 months to essentially extinguish the virus. And then you could turn the economy back on and go back to normal. That's not happening. It's a much slower recovery just because the virus continues to spread and we have not extinguished the virus in any sense of the word. And so that has profound implications, obviously, for businesses. I think a lot of the programs that Congress put out in March and April were designed to be short-term bridges. So many of you may be familiar with the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP focused on small businesses, almost a $700 billion program. It was designed to help businesses bridge for a couple months. Shutdown will help you cover your expenses for a couple months and you can turn back on. That's great, but what happens if the shutdown for those businesses is a year? That's not going to be enough of a solution. And so the challenge becomes when temporary shutdowns lead to permanent closures and bankruptcies, that is really going to dampen the economic recovery. I mean, just think about this. Think if there are thousands of restaurants across America, maybe tens of thousands, that go out of business. Think about all the vacant storefronts across the country that are going to have a going out of business sign, that are going to be vacant. How long does it take for a new restaurant to form, to take over that space, to refurbish the space, to hire the staff, and to start operating again? It's really going to slow down the recovery, sadly, if we go through that kind of bankruptcy process. Congress has been very bold and very aggressive in a bipartisan way, which is terrific, both in trying to help businesses get through this, but importantly in helping workers get through this. We've seen 10, 30, 40 million Americans having lost their jobs, just huge numbers. And people have to put food on the table. They have to pay their bills, they have to pay their mortgage, they have to pay their rent. I think Congress has been focused on both businesses, but also on workers. I think that's been really appropriate. And I expect if this is going to take a long time, as I think it will, we're going to need to see more support for workers who've lost their jobs. Because if they can't pay their bills, then this spills over into a broader economic crisis. Because then, think of it this way. Somebody can't pay their rent for their home where they live. Then their landlord can't pay his or her mortgage. And then it goes into the banking sector. And so there are these spillovers that potentially could happen. And so I think the best news of this terrible crisis is the way our political system has rallied together to really aggressively support the American economy, American businesses, and most importantly, American workers. And I didn't know if that was going to happen, by the way. 3-4 months ago, we're still a politically divided country. 3 or 4 months ago, it was really unclear in my mind if Congress would come together and put politics aside, and they did. And I really applaud them for that. And I hope that they will continue to do that. So, we can get into this in a lot more detail, but Paula, why don't I just press pause there as my brief intro, and we can go into Q&A.
Okay, perfect. Just as a little bit of background, as you know, virtually all the women on the call are sitting corporate directors of public or large private companies. So they have a voice in helping shape these companies and helping get these companies prepared for whatever this uncertain future looks like. So we're keenly interested in your views on how we can plan for this uncertain future, manage the associated risks for the companies we serve, and what key metrics should we watch in the economic recovery, and how far out in the future do we need to be scenario planning?
Well, I would scenario plan for the next couple of years. I mean, one scenario, the best case scenario, is that the virus on its own just kind of burns away. I see no evidence that that's happening, but I also cannot rule it out. That would be absolutely the best case scenario. A second scenario is we're kind of just on hold where we are right now, where the virus just continues just to spread the way that it is, but not a massive acceleration. A third possible scenario is that we do get a big second wave. Now, we study, and especially the health experts, study prior pandemics because they often have similar patterns. And the big one was the flu pandemic of 1918, which emerged in the spring, had a big run up in the spring, then it went quiet over the summer, and then it came raging back in the fall in a monster wave in the fall, and that's really where the big devastation was. That's probably the worst case scenario if that were to happen here. But right now, we just don't know. We would have expected if that were to happen that it would be falling off more than it is right now. You know, some of our economists at the Minneapolis Fed, it's interesting what's going on right now. So Minnesota is looking pretty good. And then you have states like Florida, Texas, Arizona, where it's really dramatically climbing. So one theory that is just a theory, we can't prove it, is it's not just about temperature, it's about whether you're indoors or outside. So for the last month, the weather's gotten good in Minnesota, so we're all outside a lot more. Well, in the last month in Texas and Arizona and Florida, it's gotten really hot, so people are inside. And you know, we look at anecdotes such as all of the protests. We have not seen any evidence of big flare-ups from the mass protests that took place 2 to 3 weeks ago. We easily could have seen those. We've been looking for it. The good news is those protests were outside. And so, you know, there's a lot that we don't know right now. But the risk for us in Minnesota is that when fall comes back and it starts to get cold again and we move back indoors, does that end up being the trigger for flaring back up here in Minnesota? And as you look around the world, there are other countries who didn't quite declare victory, but you know, we're pretty happy with how they dealt with the crisis. You're also seeing flare-ups back there again. And so we're monitoring the whole world to see what we can learn. Unfortunately, there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that the health experts don't know. And that means that when you think about scenario planning, you have to plan for these wide range of outcomes. And that's really difficult to do. I know that.
Thank you. You know, unemployment has started to decline a little bit, 14.5 to 13.5, and other economic indicators have looked like they're improving. But you just alluded to the fact that there are these outbreaks happening in the southern areas. And Dr. Osterholm just stated today, his little quote was, well, it's more like a forest fire. We don't think it's a second wave, but the fire is still burning fiercely. So when you look at some of the positive trends, but then the numbers going back up, I mean, what do you really think the trends are going to look like? It's confounding for us who sit in boardrooms to really say, okay, should we even doing these scenario plans for up to 2 years, which economic indicators should we be paying more attention to? Is it really the number of viruses? Is it the number of deaths? Is it really unemployment? Is it really the resurgence of the retail economy? I mean, what things do you look at that are the most indicative of, you know, showing some promise?
I mean, obviously, I was happy, and we were all happy to see more Americans finding work than expected. Mm-hmm. But it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because it just meant that we're not socially distancing as much as we thought we were. And maybe we're reopening the economy before it is fully safe to do so. And so, yes, we all want to reopen the economy, but it doesn't do anybody any good to reopen the economy and then have another wave get triggered because we reopen the economy prematurely. And there's a debate about testing. You test more people. Some people argue, well, you're going to find more cases. That certainly there's some truth to that. To me, I think the measures that you can't argue with are hospitalizations, admissions to ICUs, and sadly, unfortunately, deaths. Now you're seeing some evidence that deaths appear to be declining while hospitalizations are increasing in some of the states that you mentioned. They say that that's because younger people are getting infected, so they're not dying as much. Well, I mean, that's good news that they're not dying, but we had this hope that maybe young people were just not going to be that vulnerable to this disease. And so for me, I'm mostly paying attention to hospitalizations, admissions in ICUs, and deaths, because that's not a measurement issue. You're either in the hospital or you're not.
Right.
So that's where I'm focused. And ultimately, again, I just keep repeating for myself, the path of the virus is what's going to determine the path of the economy. And so the unemployment numbers are not as important to me as what's happening with the virus around the country.
Helpful, really helpful. So New York just announced, and other places are, that people are able to go back to work. You're able to reopen offices in certain cities, and yet most offices and companies aren't reopening, and even worse, the workers are even more reluctant to go back. So how does that affect productivity? How does that affect even the real estate market in the future for commercial real estate, for planning for what kind of space needs companies have? I mean, it's good for the health side, but it's a big double-edged sword.
Yeah, I think it's again, I apologize. You're going to be frustrated that you're saying I don't know. We're thinking about these issues too. At the Minneapolis Fed, we have about 1,000 employees. 95% of us, including myself, are working from home. I go in the office every week or two. Our management team rotates who's in the office. I was there earlier today. I'm in my basement right now. We found, like many companies, that we're able to work from home remotely effectively. And so that's good. So we don't feel any pressure to hurry up and rush back into the office. We can take our time. Not every company can do that. And so I think that's a big consideration for the companies that cannot do it effectively. I think they're going to need to focus on how do we reorient our layouts. So how do we put up plastic barriers? How do we make sure that we do the right screenings so our employees can come back and be safe? So think about real estate. For those companies where you have to be on site to be effective, their demand for real estate may increase because they simply need more space to accommodate their workers. And you would say, well, their productivity may go down somewhat because their costs are going to go up, needing to support that additional space. Other companies that are more effective or are equally effective remotely, you could imagine over time their demands for real estate may go down. So which one is going to dominate between those two? I don't know. I also think on the residential market, if we are effective working remotely, then maybe there's going to be less demand for living in the center of a city. And more people say, you know what, I can work in the suburbs and be very effective, and then maybe I go into the office a few days a week. I think the long-term changes that come from this are really unclear right now. I don't buy into the Silicon Valley hyperbole that no one's going to work in an office anymore. We're all going to work remotely. I don't believe that. I think part of the reason we've been as effective as we are is because we spent the last X number of years working together. We know each other, we built these relationships, and we're now drawing on that experience. But as you hire new people, and how do you integrate them into your teams, is that as effective? I'm skeptical that we're just simply going to go to a full virtual environment going forward. So again, I don't have a clear answer, but it's an important question.
So a question from one of our members. There's been a lot of talk about the new normal in healthcare post-COVID-19, which clearly we're not post yet, as well as the reimagining of education, economic opportunities, and social justice to eradicate current racial bias across all of our systems. Trying to think past and step out of the current moment, maybe to mid-2021 and beyond, what trends or key metrics should business leaders and boards be looking at as the best guideposts for decisions and actions they need to take for both reinvention needs and long-term success?
Well, I'll just say what we're very focused on, and we're very focused on many of the issues that the person asked about. We work really hard to try to make sure that the Minneapolis Fed reflects the community that we serve. and that we draw from. And, it's not a perfect answer to, there's a lot in there in the question about, social justice and economic justice. And I'm hopeful we'll talk about education, which I just think is absolutely at the foundation of achieving justice across those many dimensions. But in terms of an employer and workforce, we work very hard to make sure that we reflect the community we serve, because we need the community to trust us, to have confidence in us. And they're only going to have confidence in us if we, in fact, draw from the community that we are meant to represent. So we have a lot of programs. We made a lot of progress in the last several years in increasing the diversity of our, especially of our management team, but across our organization. And we can talk about that. But I think the more that our organizations can look like our communities, the more effective we are going to be in being part of our communities and in serving those communities.
You shared with me some best practices that you did when you came into your new role in 2016, and it really created the opportunity to have your workforce better reflect the community that you live in. Do you want to go into, can you share a little bit more detail on that? Because I thought it was quite profound.
So when I joined the Minneapolis Fed in January 2016, about 12% of our officers, these are the top 60 people in our bank, assistant vice presidents all the way up to the president of the bank, about 12% of them were persons of color. And if you look at the Minneapolis St. Paul region, the region is about 24% diverse. So we're about half that. And we said, look, we want to reflect the community that we serve, and we want to hire the very best talent available. So we did lots of things. We did adopted panel interviews. We forced ourselves to have diverse slates of candidates. All of those things were important. But the thing that moved the needle the most, which was not planned, I stumbled upon it, is when I joined the bank, I found that there was a culture of job for life. People join the bank, they get promoted, they stay their whole life, and then they retire. And there was a culture of not challenging or confronting underperformance. And for its own sake, I said, no, if we have underperforming, especially senior people, we are absolutely going to address that head on and try to work with them to help them improve their performance. And if they're not capable of improving their performance, then we're going to have to make the hard choice of exiting from the bank and then go out and bringing in, hopefully, a better fit for the bank. Well, we really aggressively did this. And we've actually had a lot of turnover as a result of this. And that has created space for us to go out and hire the very best talent available. So we've doubled our diversity of our officers in under 5 years, 4.5 years, and there's been no trade-off. This has not been a question of, diversity or talent. We have dramatically improved the talent of our officers and increased the diversity at the same time. And I'm really excited about that and pleased with that. And we're not done yet. We always want to get the best talent we can. But the most important thing we did was confronting underperformance. That was more important than diverse panels and diverse slates of candidates. It was addressing the underperformance, because that created the space to then go out and bring the very best talent available. And I wish I could tell you it was a grand plan on mine. It was not. We kind of stumbled into it, but it ended up being very effective.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing success story. And the thing I found so profound is that it was creating the space that could accelerate, the results of having a much more diverse workforce. And I've never really thought about it in that manner, because it's usually not always so much an either or of a trade-off on performance versus diversity, but without creating the space, it takes a much longer period of time to really be able to kind of right size what it should look like. So
Yes.
I think, thank you for sharing that. Another question from the group that I just received: the stock market and the economy are profoundly disconnected right now. You said, as the virus goes, so goes the economy. What measures of the economy should we be paying attention to right now?
Well, I think we talked about the measures of the virus. So that's hospitalizations, cases, hospitalizations, ICUs, and sadly deaths. In terms of the economy, it is going to be, once we start to get through this, how quickly can businesses come back online, and how many businesses, unfortunately, are not going to make it through. I mean, even in the Twin Cities, we've already seen some restaurants announce that they're closing down for good, even very early, they just said their margins were so thin in good times that they just couldn't even make it for a brief period of time. So to me, another key factor is, are we going to see a wave of bankruptcies of small, mid-sized, and even large companies? Because if we do that, that process of destruction and then reallocation of resources just takes a long time for the economy, and that's going to slow the economic recovery down. So then that comes back to what's going to determine that. Part of what's going to determine that is the course of the virus, as we've discussed. The other part is, what is Congress going to do? So as an example, Congress has been generous with the Paycheck Protection Program to help small businesses. But if this is going to go on for 6 months, 9 months, a year, is Congress going to want to do more to help small businesses? That's an open question. They've also been aggressive with unemployment assistance and the extra unemployment benefits, the extra $600. Are they going to re-up that and continue that? So those are some big public policy questions that I think are going to have a big effect on what the recovery ends up looking like. But right now, we're not even talking about the recovery. We got to get the virus under control and behind us to really be thinking about recovery. Right now, we're kind of in a holding pattern in terms of the economy.
Okay, yeah, true. It's a very challenging time for all of us. How important are schools reopening in the fall to the economy and to getting people back to work? And do you think education is suffering with all of the homeschooling?
Yeah, I think it's enormously important, but it's this is another example of big, important public policy questions that the best health experts in the world don't have answers to. So I'll give you an example. If you keep schools closed, we know there are big costs. One cost is many parents then can't go back to work. So there's economic costs of that. I think it's also become clear that there are huge costs to children's education from keeping them at home. One is, of course, lower income families don't have access, or rural families don't have the internet access that they need, or may not have the computers at home. So there's big disparities associated with that. And it's expanding the education disparities that already existed. But I'll tell you this, my daughter's only 17 months old, so too young to be affected by this. But most of my friends who have school-age children are saying their kids are not getting anywhere near the education that they got when they were in school. I've read reports in the newspaper about the percentage of children who are supposed to be online. These are anecdotes. 20, 30% have never even logged onto the site that they're supposed to be logging onto every day. It depends on the school district, depends on the family, but I think there are enormous costs to those children and to society in terms of their lost education by keeping them at home. Having said that, here's what the health experts don't know. Are schools little incubators of COVID transmission? And even if the children are not at high health risk, might they be passing it to each other and to their children, or to their teachers, and back to their parents and grandparents? Health experts don't know. And so these are foundational, fundamental questions that are enormously important to arresting the virus and getting our economy moving again, and we just don't know the answer to it. And that's what's frustrating about it. A lot of people are working on trying to find the answers. I wish I knew.
And so some colleges have declared they're going back. What do you think about that? Is that just a bold move? Is it a leadership move? Is it just somebody just operating from their gut?
I think it's people you got to make decisions even if you don't have complete information. No decision is probably the only thing that's unacceptable. You have some colleges who put a stake in the ground. We're reopening. College is about the face-to-face experience. We're doing it. And then you have other colleges who say, nope, we're all online for the rest, for the full 2020 year. And then they'll consider 2021 based on what's happening in the virus. And so I don't know. I don't think there is a clear right answer. And so I can't criticize either of them for saying they're making the wrong choice. I think the ones that are trying to go back are doing what they can to try to implement social distancing, to try to make sure that their professors are safe. They're probably the ones that are most at risk. How you implement social distancing in a dorm, I just don't know. You can get everybody to promise everything that you ask them to, but at least when I was in college, it was a fool's errand.
Right. I know that you are particularly passionate about education as being a pretty significant lever in the racial disparity and really preparing equal employment across race. Maybe you can speak about that and what you're doing with Alan Page.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, education is at the root of so many of the disparities that we hear about and we care about, whether it's housing disparities, job opportunities, wages, healthcare disparities. The fact of the matter is, people who get more and better education earn more money, have more job opportunities, live in better, safer neighborhoods, get access to better schools for their kids. I mean, everybody I'm speaking to knows this intuitively based on your own life. So Minnesota, one of my big surprises moving to Minnesota 5 years ago was to discover that we have some of the worst education disparities in the country. I mean, the state has so much going for it in terms of industries, on average, good schools, the university systems, the colleges. It was a head scratcher to me. How can we have these giant racial and economic K through 12, especially disparities? So I challenged my researchers at the Minneapolis Fed to help me understand it. And what we really determined was that, you can actually tackle this problem. If you look at some other states have made transformational reforms that have improved the education outcome for their lower income students, but Minnesota hasn't. And it really seems like to us, politics is getting in the way. Republicans have their set of proposed solutions. Democrats have their set of proposed solutions. The two sides don't agree. And so they basically got nothing meaningfully done. There's been 50 or 100 little tiny piecemeal changes that have been tried in the last 20 years. But if you look at the data, zero, big fat zero in actual improvement in outcomes. If anything, the gaps are getting worse. And so a year and a half ago, I reached out to former Supreme Court Justice Alan Page, both because he spent 22 years on the Minnesota Supreme Court and because I know that he's had a lifetime of passion for education, having founded the Page Education Foundation, focused on helping children of color getting into college. And I asked him, I said, is there a way that we could use the legal system to break through this political logjam, specifically the Minnesota Constitution? And he said yes, and we started working together on this. So the Minnesota Constitution has an education provision today that says all children have Minnesota, effectively, I'm giving you layman's terms, all children in Minnesota have the right to access an adequate education system. Well, what is an adequate education system? Turns out an adequate education system is a system that on average is adequate. If you're from a well-to-do family, it's a great education system. If you're from a low-income family, it's a lousy education system. And by the way, tough luck if your children end up at the bottom of that education system. That's what's in Minnesota's Constitution today. You know what? It was written in 1857. It has not changed since 1857, the education provision. And it was basically written to make sure that the children of wealthy landowners got an education. It's kind of performing exactly as it was designed in 1857.
Wow.
So Alan Page and I have drafted a proposed amendment to that Constitution that would guarantee every child in Minnesota the right to a high quality public education. And why does the Constitution matter? The Constitution is our framework from which our laws then follow. And it would put enormous pressure on the legislature and the executive branch to come together to make transformational changes to make sure all children in Minnesota have a high quality public education. And if they fail to do that, it would give their families the ability to go to court and say that my child's civil rights are being violated. One of the things I've learned over my life is that you don't transform a system by tinkering around the edges. You transform the system with bold, transformational, sweeping changes, and changing the Constitution to establish a civil right for all Minnesota children is the most powerful way we could come up with to do it. Now, we announced it in January. We were making good progress. You need the House and Senate of the legislature to vote for it, a majority of each body, to go to the ballot, and then a majority of voters to then vote for it to amend the Constitution. We actually united liberal Democrats from the Posse Caucus, the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus. So minority Democrats were united with conservative Republicans from greater Minnesota. Kind of unusual to put those two together, But this is not simply about the urban center of the Twin Cities. In greater Minnesota, a lot of low-income families in rural communities are not getting access to a good education. So this is actually a statewide issue, and the data shows that. So we were uniting folks across party lines. And then when the COVID crisis hit, we had to press pause because everything basically shut down and the legislature had to focus on COVID. But Justice Page and I are totally committed to this, and looking forward to getting back focused on this as soon as the legislative opportunity presents itself. Thank you for the question, Paula.
Yes, of course. And kind of a more business side of the questions. What should companies be thinking about in terms of supply chains? And in particular, how do we manage or unravel our dependence on China and India for medical and pharmaceutical products?
Well, that's a huge challenge, and I'm hoping that maybe this crisis itself will have opened the medical industry's eyes to the exposures that they themselves have. I don't know enough to say whether the government needs to come in and mandate diversity of suppliers. So you're not just going to China or not just going to India, but you could source your products from around the world, including domestically at home. I don't know if it needs government intervention to mandate that, or if the companies themselves have now realized their own exposure. So I'm not close enough to the medical supply chain industry to know what the right answer is, but I think we've all learned, and that's one of the things you mentioned, Mike Osterholm, somebody I talk to a lot.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things he's been very focused on is how much of our critical medical supplies in responding to the COVID crisis are coming from abroad. And and it's not just the PPE, it's also the therapeutics and the medicines, et cetera. A lot of those are not sourced domestically, but we have to go abroad, and that just potentially slows things down and complicates things. So it's an important issue.
No, yeah, I mean, it's the world I live in, so it's a bit near and dear to my heart, and really just illustrated how vulnerable we are when you have a crisis like this and you can't get the necessary supplies, and if they cut off access to some of the important drugs that have been needed just to stabilize people. So
but let me ask you this. I'll put you on the spot for a moment, which is, do you think the industry is in a position to respond now? Have they learned their lesson? Or do we actually need the government to come in and say, hey, some of these things are critical and we can't simply leave it to industry to figure out?
I'll come back with your response. That's a really tough one.
Okay.
But I think, in fact, I think the companies do realize it, and some of the silver linings I've seen coming out of the whole COVID crisis are companies, sharing design specs and code, so other American companies can build these highly regulated products, and that's been a success story in terms of increasing availability where American companies can support each other. So you'd like to think it's a big enough wake-up call that government doesn't have to mandate, but there are such significant economic circumstances that from a pricing and profitability standpoint, you're at a disadvantage if you're not sourcing a lot of your product and having it built overseas. So
Right.
It really creates a fundamental kind of marketplace issue. So is it really government's role? Probably not, but it's something near and dear to, I think, all of our hearts when we could possibly be cut off from life-saving technologies that would be for all the wrong reasons. Okay, I'll switch gears a little bit. What have you seen in the most successful and savvy companies and boards during this period of global health and economic crisis that's impressed you the most? You're out there in the market, I'm certain, talking to a lot of these companies. Are there things that we could learn from that you're seeing from both companies and different countries that those of us sitting in the boardroom should be taking into consideration and raising so we can be that much more effective and learning from others?
I overall, I've seen most businesses that I've talked to, especially the larger businesses, have been nimble and have been creative in how they're responding to this and adjusting their business practices to try to ensure safety, that they can operate, et cetera. I think the thing that has surprised me in a good way is how much they're willing, just as you said, how much they're willing to share with each other. what they're learning, because this is new for everybody. And so if somebody has a way of reopening a retail storefront and doing it safely and that's not highly disruptive, they've been willing to share that with others or their manufacturing centers, et cetera. So I think that has been the thing that has surprised me the most. So I don't have any one specific thing to share that, hey, you should all be doing this. Moreover, I'm just impressed that people are trying different things and they're sharing what they're learning and what their experience has been. I mean, I've heard anecdotes of companies that have now for a few months been giving temperature tests to all of their employees. You know, we can't yet test all of our employees for COVID. It'd be great if we could. The health scientists say that that's a long way off from being able to do that in real time. But there are basic things we can do with health screening, temperature checking, et cetera. And that actually makes a difference. It's not perfect, but it actually makes a big difference. And so I think that just the sharing of best practices, company to company, I think is really positive, and we should just keep doing that.
Given we're all sitting in Minnesota, or most of us on the call, not only in Minnesota, but across the country, the George Floyd death has, and the implications on society, the economy, and business has been very profound. When you think about the economic impact of COVID and then the George Floyd death on top of it a couple months later, how do you factor in that aspect? Because we've spent a lot of time talking about the COVID side of it, and the disease is going to kind of dictate in some ways the economic recovery. But now with the George Floyd death on top of it, it's really a double whammy. I mean, we have to rebuild so many businesses that even in our fine city have been burnt down to the ground, and the same has happened other places. As you look at how you're influencing monetary policy, how do you factor that second gigantic blow to what's going on economically and society, and from a societal standpoint, and how can we best think that through and be prepared for how to manage it through it?
Well, I think it's hard. I think it manifests itself in a number of different ways. So you talked about the direct economic costs of the damage that's been done for the businesses that have been closed and lost. That's probably the easiest to quantify. I think there's psychological effects on everybody, you know, and seeing something so jarring. I think in particular, there have been studies that have already been written about the psychological effects on African Americans, specifically when they see things like this happen. And you know, how does that show up in the economy? I mean, I think it'll show up a lot of different ways, probably for all of us, you know, if we're thinking about these horrible things that we see and the injustices in society, you know, that's going to weigh on our economy. That's going to make us all less productive. That's going to make us, you know, less enthusiastic when we go to work, just because we're all carrying this with us. You know, I'm sure your businesses are doing this too. We've had sessions within our bank where we're letting our staff give a chance to talk about what they've experienced, what they're seeing, and they've been really appreciated. And you know, people have been very honest internally about sharing with their colleagues, with all of us, what their own life experiences have been, what they're seeing, what their fears are today for their children, and for the future. And so I think all of these things ultimately affect the way we operate and will have an effect on the economy. Then there are other things, you know, if the local community does not have confidence in the police, and you're already seeing this in the Twin Cities. There have been anecdotes of local communities saying, you know what, we're going to police our own neighborhoods. Maybe your business says, hey, we don't have confidence in the police, so we're going to have to hire our own security force. That'll have an effect on productivity. If all these businesses say, you know, we just have to hire our own security because we can't count on the police, that's also going to have an effect on safety. Or if you see that local communities say, we're going to police our own neighborhoods. There have been anecdotes of militia may be the wrong word, local community groups coming together saying, we're going to police the streets at night. That might make them feel safe. That might make other people feel unsafe if their neighbors now are walking around armed. And so, you know, what are the long-term effects of these? I don't know. And how does this shake out? I don't think any of this is good in terms of economic growth. The good economic growth will be if we can really address the root cause of this, which is institutional racism in many of our institutions. You know, rooting that out would be great for the economy, because then we could all live fully and not have these fears and contribute everything and not need to have, be looking over our shoulders all the time.
So that is a good segue into one of the questions that just came in, since we had been talking about education as kind of being a piece of the future for trying to get to that point. And let me see if I can kind of read this on the fly. But there are many in the community who are still not using banks or can't get loans. Redefining has left a
Redlining.
Redlining, yes, I'm sorry. I was just not able to read. Redlining has left a lasting negative impact on Blacks and Brown communities. In your bank supervisory capacity, what are you seeing banks in your purview planning to do differently to reverse these impacts and start to economically benefit and impact communities of color, and particularly Black communities?
Well, this is something that we are very focused on, not just the Minneapolis Fed, all the Federal Reserve banks, and this is related to the Community Reinvestment Act, making sure that all communities have fair and equal access to credit. And it's a big challenge, because when you dig into the data, and we have looked in the data, you can clearly see that some communities have more access to credit than others. But when you look in the data and you say, well, certain communities have higher incomes than others, it's kind of intuitively obvious. If you were a banker, you'd be more willing to lend money to somebody who has more income or a higher credit score than lower income and lower credit score. So part of the problem is there simply are not banks and branches in some neighborhoods. So there's physically not a place to go to open a bank account. That's one challenge. Another challenge then becomes the variable in income levels that people have, which contributes to their access to credit. And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you have lower income and you can't qualify for a loan to buy a house, then you can't build wealth by owning that home, as it would hopefully appreciate over time. So we are very focused on this. We continue to be, we've got a community development group that goes out and partners with local communities to try to see how we bring more access to credit. It's something that we're focused on and we work on, but there are not easy answers immediately available. One of the things that happened after 2008, the housing bust happened, the financial crisis happened, markets then recovered, the banking system recovered, and basically what ended up happening is low credit score people got cut off from credit. And banks just said, well, it's not safe for us to make loans to people with low credit scores, so we're not going to make them anymore. So if you look at there's a lot of access to credit today, but it's people with higher income and better credit scores. And that's a very difficult problem that I don't think we have figured out how to solve yet. And so for me, long term, I keep coming back to education. It doesn't solve everything, but if people have access to more and better education, they end up getting higher wages, better jobs, and more access to credit. I know that's a long-term solution. It's not a short-term fix.
Right. Okay, going back a little bit to the economy, you've been quoted as saying the V-shaped recession has passed us. What does it look like now?
I think it's just a slow, gradual recovery. So V-shaped recovery, you bounce back to where you were in a few months, maybe, or a quarter or two. To me, I expect the unemployment rate will likely still be double digits at the end of this year. My base case scenario, unfortunately, is that we're going to see a second wave of the virus. And that probably means the unemployment rate will either stop falling or may even climb again by the end of the year. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that there's some breakthrough in a therapy or a vaccine that can surprise us and we can arrest this more quickly. We would need some kind of a breakthrough like that for us to have a V-shaped recovery. And it just seems like nothing that I've learned from the health experts say that that's likely.
If we have a wave, this is another question that just came in. If we have a wave of bankruptcies and insufficient government support, how patient will accountants and regulators be with a capitalization of banks? This is both a domestic and international issue.
Well, that's something that's a good question. We know the longer this goes on, that the losses eventually roll up into the banking industry. So if you can't pay your rent, then your landlord can't pay his or her mortgage, and then the bank ends up taking losses. Or if the coffee shop closes down for good, they're not going to pay rent on that strip mall. Then that strip mall owner can't pay his or her mortgage, rolls up into the banking sector. So a month or two ago, I actually wrote an op-ed on this issue in the Financial Times, where I said that the biggest banks in America should go raise capital now as a way of making sure they have enough capital to withstand losses under all but the most dire COVID scenarios. In a sense, the big banks in America could inoculate themselves against the COVID crisis by stopping paying dividends and by going out and issuing stock now. Now, if the virus ends up being not as bad as we fear, that's great. Then they can always buy back their stock a year or two from now or issue out dividends a couple of years from now. But they could actually inoculate themselves. So it is something that I'm worried about. And it's going to depend on a lot of factors. What happens with the virus, and then ultimately what happens with what support Congress chooses to continue to provide to the American people. I mean, they're not going to like me saying this, but when Congress does stimulus checks to the American people, and when they do enhanced unemployment benefits, that's a bailout for the banks, because it enables Americans to pay their rent, to pay their mortgage, and then that flows up into the banking sector. So banks are getting their bailout right now through the stimulus checks and the additional unemployment assistance. Question is, how long is Congress going to continue those? And I don't know.
Right. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about on July 31st, when the added unemployment benefit goes away, then what? Now, that's a yin and a yang, because I know a lot of people who own businesses and their workers don't want to come back to work because they're making more money, which was the unintended consequence of the extra stimulus that you're saying is also kind of protecting banks right now. But to get people back to work, there needs to be seems to me, some leveling of that. I mean, right. What do you think is the next lever? I mean, Congress, I anticipate, is really still grappling with what's the next package going to look like? What key areas do you think should be in that package to have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact is going to be to workers who've lost their jobs, so that they can pay their rent and make their car payment and pay their mortgage and put food on the table. And I've heard those anecdotes that, oh, now my workers don't want to come back. I think this is really overblown. I think this is, I mean, I'm sure it's literally true for some businesses, but when you have, I think the real unemployment rate today is around 20%. You know, the official rate's around 14%, but a lot of people, you know, to be counted as unemployed, you have to actively be looking for work. Now, we've told people stay home. So a lot of people are not actively looking for work. So they're not actually counted as unemployed. So I think the real unemployment rate is around 20% today. If you have 20% of Americans unemployed, I'm not that sympathetic to the businesses who say, I can't find any workers. You know, I find that a little bit hard to square. But let's just take it literally. So one way you could do this is you could say, well, we'll continue the enhanced unemployment benefits up to a cap of your prior wages. Now, the challenge is the states have to implement that in their computer systems, and maybe it's complicated for them. Hopefully they've been working on it, because we've now had a few months at this. But that would be a way of eliminating the disincentive to return to work, but also making sure people have extra support so that they can pay their bills.
So what's your view on inflation right now during the pending recovery? And how does the Fed think about inflation, interest rates, and combined with government programs?
Well, inflation is part of one of our mandates. So we always talk about a dual mandate. And that means we've got two goals that we're trying to achieve simultaneously. Let me just put my water bottle down. One is we want stable prices, and that means we define stable prices as 2% inflation. And the other is maximum employment, as many Americans as possible who want to work are able to find jobs. And usually we think these two goals are like a seesaw trading off each other. So the economy heats up, the unemployment rate falls, businesses have to compete with each other to find workers, they pay more, and then inflation takes off. So unemployment and inflation, we think, are linked like a seesaw. Well, the remarkable thing happened in the last expansion. The job market got stronger and stronger and stronger. We kept thinking we're at full employment, and more Americans came off the sidelines to take jobs, and inflation didn't come. We were running at around 1.5 or 1.6% inflation for the last decade instead of 2% inflation. So we were undershooting our inflation target, and there was still slack in the labor market. So that was a high-class problem in a sense that we didn't have to trade off these two things. Now, with the COVID crisis and so many people out of work, inflation is running even lower. And I would expect inflation to continue running low for the foreseeable future. Now, one concern that some people have is, while you're running these giant government deficits, Congress passing these multi-trillion-dollar stimulus programs, they're borrowing a lot of money. Is that going to lead to inflation? Not in the near term. I mean, in the near term, the Americans like me who've kept their jobs, we're saving more. I'm not going out to eat to restaurants. I'm not going out to hotels. We're not taking vacations. We're saving more. And so this is just a way of transferring, in a sense, some of that savings to meet the needs of the other part of the economy where people have been laid off. So I'm not worried about the debt in the short run. In the long run, we do know we have to get our fiscal house in order, and it's not about COVID. It's about our entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, that are funded by current workers paying for current retirees. As a society, we're having fewer children than prior generations, so our society is aging, and that ratio of current workers to current retirees is going down. And that ultimately is what drives our programs into the red and the government debt up and up and up over the next 20 or 30 years. That's the key challenge for us. And that is a political challenge of how do we reconcile the math there, which we can talk about. But it's not, I'm not worried about the debt from the COVID crisis.
Okay, interesting. Because one of the questions that had also come in is, how much debt can our government really take on to help both businesses and individuals weather the storm? And what are we saddling future generations with?
I think the government is doing the right thing right now. And as evidence of this, if you look at, so the US government has issued another $3 trillion or so for the new stimulus. So this was not expected 6 months ago. And now they've gone and issued another $3 trillion of money to support the economy and COVID. The US government is still borrowing at very, very low rates relative to history. You would think that if investors were saying, boy, we're concerned about all this debt, you would think it would be showing up in higher borrowing costs for the US government, but it really isn't. And not just here at home, it's also true in Europe, it's also true in Japan. And so I think investors are saying they have a lot of confidence in the US economy's ability to absorb this debt and to support this debt, and that we have to get the crisis behind us, and then we have to get the economy growing again. Ultimately, long-term, we do have to get our fiscal house in order. We can afford to spend the money we need to get through the COVID crisis, but then we need to get back to growth. And then we need to really address these structural deficits, which are Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security predominantly.
Thank you. What about corporate debt? Is the level of corporate debt greatly different than when you ran TARP? And if so, what does that mean to the recovery?
It is. Corporations have taken on more debt, increasing debt over the last 30 years. It just keeps, as a share of GDP, it keeps going up. And it is concerning, but it's also, it's hard to know how much is too much. And here's the challenge. So one of the criticisms of the Fed and the interest rates that we've been running is that they say, well, you're boosting the stock market and you're encouraging companies to take on a lot more debt. And is this going to be a bubble that sometimes bursts? Well, are we encouraging companies to take on more debt, or are companies realizing we're in a low interest rate environment? And this is like a really complicated but fundamental issue around monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve moves interest rates up and down. When the economy looks like it's overheating, we'll raise rates. And when the economy looks like it's slowing down, we'll cut interest rates. But what interest rate represents neutral? What interest rate neither stimulates nor restrains the economy? We don't know exactly. We can try to estimate it. And our best estimate is that over the last 30 years, it has gradually been declining. So we've been moving interest rates up and down around this gradually declining trend of where neutral is. Well, what sets that trend? That trend is being set by broader macroeconomic factors, such as demographics, the aging of society, such as technology development. Right now, for the last decade, there has been a lack of demand for investment capital, and that has meant that interest rates are low. And the Federal Reserve has just been responding to where that demand for money has been. And as evidence of that, you see a lot of businesses that are buying back their stock rather than plowing it into investing in a new factory, for example. I mean, the biggest demand for investment capital in America has come from the oil fields in the last decade, the fracking boom in North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Texas. That's taken a lot of capital to go do that. But where are the other big demands for capital? And so this is a long, convoluted answer because it's a very complicated question. One view of corporate debt today is that investors and companies are realizing that we are in a low interest rate environment for the foreseeable future. And in a low interest rate environment for the foreseeable future, it may make more sense to take on more debt because the debt service costs are low, rather than if we were in a high interest, high growth environment, it would make less sense to take on that amount of debt. And so what's the right level of debt? I don't know, but I do know it's affected by this broader macroeconomic environment that we at the Fed have to respond to. We're not setting that macro environment.
So when you think about what was going on during TARP, when you were leading the charge in 2008, I mean, it was a different economic crisis, but are there things that we can learn from that and apply to this situation?
Well, one of the things that I learned about our response is, well, a few things. One is we were too slow in responding to the '08 crisis. And I think we've learned that lesson. The Fed has been much more aggressive and much faster this time than they were in 2007 and 2008. We didn't want to overreact to the crisis, but it turned out it would have been better to overreact than to underreact. And I think that policymakers now have learned that lesson. Another lesson is that we were too targeted in some of our programs in providing assistance. So we had many housing programs under Presidents Bush and Obama. We tried to target those housing programs to reach those homeowners who were quote unquote deserving, meaning they just needed a little bit of help. It's not that they were high risk, bought some home they could never hope to afford, because a lot of Americans were angry at the thought of bailing out their neighbors. Well, when we targeted those programs, it ended up that we didn't help very many homeowners. And it ended up that the housing crisis was more severe than I believe it needed to be. In a sense, we cost the American people money by trying to save them money. So today, one of the lessons is be generous. Help as many small businesses as you can, help as many workers as you can. Whether they're deserving or not, don't worry about it. You're just trying to put the fire out. And I think Congress also learned that lesson, and they're being more generous with these programs, such as the Paycheck Protection Program. And I think that's the right call.
So, but clearly people are starting to default on mortgages. Can the banks handle this? Are they prepared? Is there going to be another mortgage crisis?
Well, I don't know. Right now, you are seeing losses start to tick up in the banking sector, and it really is going to depend on, as I said earlier, what is Congress's response in terms of helping people who've lost their jobs and how long they're going to do that, and then how long the virus goes on and how long this crisis goes on. I don't know.
So another question from a member: the Fed has taken unprecedented action intervening as the coronavirus pandemic unfolded, including a recent commitment to buy corporate bonds in addition to Treasury securities. Observers describe the Fed's approach as similar to that in Japan, where the government has taken control of the yield curve, quote unquote. Could you comment on how intervention in this crisis is different than those actions taken in the past, and why?
Well, I think we've been more aggressive than was done in '07 and '08. Many of the facilities, we launched these special facilities, whether it's focused on the commercial paper market or now the corporate bond market, or providing more liquidity to treasuries and whatnot. Many of these were done in '07 or '08. They were done much quicker this time and at much bigger scale and broader, such as getting into corporate bonds. Basically, what happened in March is everybody got scared by the virus, including businesses, and they said, we just want cash. We don't want corporate bonds. We don't want commercial paper. We don't even want treasury bonds. We just want cash. And that's what the central bank is for. We are there as quote unquote the lender of last resort. When everybody gets scared and demands cash, we flood the system with cash to calm everybody down and to meet those needs so that we can get markets functioning again. And I'll give you an example of why this is so important. There are some sectors of the economy that are doing just fine. So think about the food business. Think about, we all go to the grocery store a lot more than we did 3 months ago, right? I go to the grocery store for my family. And think about General Mills, great Minnesota company that's doing very well, providing food for all of us. Imagine if a company like General Mills couldn't raise money in the bond market to meet its operational needs. That's how this COVID crisis could spill over into other sectors of the economy through the financial system. So the Fed moved in very, very aggressively to say, we're going to make sure that these financial markets are working and that our high quality companies are able to fund themselves at reasonable costs, reasonable rates. And that's what we've been doing. And the markets have substantially recovered. The bond market, for example, has substantially recovered relative to the stress that we saw in March. That's why the Fed has done it. I think it was totally appropriate that we did it. And there's more that we can do. Hopefully we won't need to, but we'll see.
So you've been, people might say that you're just printing money, and how long can you keep doing that?
Well, I've said this, it got some attention by some people who don't like the Fed. There's literally no limit to our ability to do that. Literally no limit, which is most of the money that we create electronically, and we create it and put it into, and then we use it to go buy bonds. Or we use it, we'll say, we'll pay a bank, and we'll say, we'll buy your treasury bonds in exchange for these things, this digital money that we call reserves. It's called the Federal Reserves, electronic, it's effectively electronic money. And that's how we end up transacting, by creating money electronically. And then we also print it with the US Treasury Department. So there's no technical limit in our ability to do that. I think there are practical limits in our ability to do that, but we are very, very, very far away from any limitation in our ability to support the US economy.
Well, that's reassuring. To a point, I guess, right?
Yeah.
In that line, I mean, you've been buying back bonds. The stock market is nearly back to original levels, and especially tech stocks are at 52-week highs. Actually, NASDAQ closed at a record high, but people are still suffering to pay their bills. What's the next lever the Fed can do with or without Congress?
Well, I think that's what you said in the question is the key, which is we have the tools to make sure the financial system is operating and that healthy businesses can access the financial markets at reasonable rates. But that's not going to address the underlying problem. The underlying problem is first and foremost the virus, and then the people who have unfortunately lost their jobs as a result of the virus. And that's where, unfortunately, it's going to be on continue to be on Congress's shoulders to do what they can. First and foremost, every dollar they spend on developing a breakthrough in a vaccine or a therapy or widespread testing will more than pay for itself by not needing to support the economy an extra week or an extra month. So that's first and foremost the highest priority. But then getting money into people's pockets so they can pay their bills and put food on the table for the duration of this crisis, I think is going to be absolutely important. So there's more the Fed can do to support the financial system. It's not clear that the financial system needs more support at this point. We'll see what happens, but really the action is going to be on what Congress decides to do next.
And is there a role for Congress and or the Fed to help stimulate some of the treatments that biotech and pharma are working on, and the vaccines to try to accelerate kind of the top performers there? Is that something that you think should be the role of the Fed or the government, or should that just be left to private sector?
Oh, for the government, for sure, not the Fed. So that's an example where Congress can make grants. So the PPP program is effectively a grant program. We can simply lend money against good collateral that we have to get paid back. But yeah, so Congress has already, and I don't know the number, if it's 50 or $100 billion, Congress has already allocated a lot of money for promising therapies and promising vaccines. Have they allocated enough? I don't know. I don't know if literally, if you could shorten this crisis by putting another $100 billion into vaccine development, that'll pay for itself in a month.
Right.
In terms of needing to support the economy. And so we've been asking the health experts, is enough money being put at this? And the answer is, I don't know right now. Right. For example, think about the moon landing or the Manhattan Project. Those were 100% financed by the government. 100% of the risk was borne by the government. So the moon landing, the big aerospace contractors did the technology development, and they built the rockets and they built the lunar lander, but the government bore 100% of the risk of the cost. Right now, I think the private sector is bearing some of the cost, maybe a lot of the cost. Maybe the government should be bearing 100% of the cost and just working with the most sophisticated biotech companies to develop it. I don't know. it's really for health policy experts to opine on. But that would be an area where I would be focusing my attention.
What will it take to get consumer confidence back? Are you going back to restaurants? When would you be comfortable attending a sporting event, a concert, or a wedding?
Yeah, not anytime soon. I mean, consumer confidence is when we're all going to be confident that it's safe. And I just don't see, my wife and I used to love to go to restaurants. Of course, then we had a baby. So then that ceased basically because we had a baby. But we would love to be able to go back to restaurants and take our daughter with us. But we're not going back until we're really sure that it's safe. And that means a vaccine or a therapy or massive, massive testing so we can be sure that everybody around us is also safe. And that ultimately, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the public and our sense of safety that is going to determine the economic lockdown and the economic recovery. It's like you said, Paula, businesses are allowed to reopen. They're allowed to send their employees back, but many of them don't want to go back and the businesses don't want to reopen. It's that sense of safety. And certainly when cases are climbing in Texas and in Arizona and Florida, that's very concerning for all of us.
Yeah. Related question that just came in. Consumer demand, both volume and expectations, appear to be shifting rapidly in this current pandemic and racial unrest period. The rapid escalation and adoption of telehealth is just one of the many examples. How do you see consumer demand changing the requirements for businesses as they seek to find ways to compete and grow in the immediate and longer term?
I think telehealth is a good example. I had visited, I can't remember if it was Rapid City. I was in South Dakota a couple of years ago. I go every year, and I visited a telehealth center where they were, beaming their health services across the country, especially the rural communities across the country. So I think telehealth is very promising and has really gotten a booster shot, so to speak, as people experimenting with it now and seeing that it can be effective for certain ailments or certain conditions and whatnot. So I think that that's positive. I think it's an open question what the long run ramifications are of this crisis. I go back to the flu pandemic of 1918. None of us were alive then. But the flu pandemic of 1918 was followed by the Roaring 20s. So, the predictions that this is a new environment we're in, everything has changed now, it's never going to go back. I'm skeptical of that. I think some things will have changed. Maybe we'll all be more comfortable working from home part of the time. Maybe we'll be more comfortable having telehealth visits with our doctor if we don't need the physical checkup, just a telehealth consult. Maybe that'll be cheaper, a way of accessing that care. So I think my guess is it'll be more incremental change than a complete transformation of how the way we live. But we'll see. Businesses can be very innovative, and we'll see what they come up with.
So another question came in that this individual said, I've heard predictions that the U.S. economy won't recover to its 2019 levels until 2022. Do you agree with that? Are there sectors and countries that will take significantly longer and others that will recover faster?
Well, I think there are sectors, I think it's going to depend on is there a second wave or not, on how long it takes us to get back to the peak GDP that we had, let's say in December or January. And that could be, if there's a second wave, that could take a year or two or more even. In terms of sectors, yeah, there are some sectors, the earlier question, when is it going to be safe? When are we going to feel safe to go back to the movie theater and be surrounded by a couple hundred strangers in a packed movie theater? That seems to me like that's going to take a long time before we come back. Same thing with concerts and sporting events. Now, maybe one of the things we learned, as I mentioned earlier, with the protests following George Floyd's murder, outdoor, maybe that's really key. So maybe it'll be safe to have outdoor football games, but maybe it won't be safe to be in a basketball arena indoors. I don't know. But I think there are going to be sectors. The travel sector seems like it's going to be very slow to recover. One thing that I learned from a health expert, she said to me that actually it's safer than you realize to travel on airplanes. I was really worried about getting back on a plane. You've got 300 people, and if you're breathing in air from somebody in the back of the plane, boy, it's a great way to spread COVID. She argued that no plane ventilation systems have been redesigned in the last 20 years. So you're really only breathing the air of the people immediately around you. So that's better than if you're breathing air from 300 people. So, I would expect travel to be one that is slower to recover. But we'll see.
I mentioned, as you know, that the NASDAQ closed at an all-time high day, clearly driven by tech stocks. But pulling the lens in closer, how do you see the next half of the year performing? We've talked kind of about how long it might take to recover, but there are some early trends in May, and hopefully we'll see a little more in June of small positive parts of recovery. Are we going to see a boon in the second half? Do you think people are just not as conservative as you and kind of sick of being at home and are going to get back out there and become consumers again? How do you look at that?
I think people do want to get back out there, and you're seeing evidence of, I think the jobs surprise of the positive jobs report a few weeks ago was indicating that people did want to get back out and want to get back to work or go back out to restaurants and whatnot. But then again, what does it mean for the virus? I keep coming back to, if you want me to tell you what the world looks like in December, you tell me what the virus looks like in December, and then I'll tell you what the economy looks like in December. And the fact that we're seeing these flare-ups around the country is very concerning. And it means that we're far, far, far from out of the woods in terms of this crisis.
Another interesting question. What's your view on finding processes for businesses and people to coexist with COVID-19 safely? You seem quite adamant that you are not one of the people that will go to a restaurant. Some businesses are finding very safe processes to operate.
I mean, if I'm convinced that they're safe to operate, and the other question is, just think of a restaurant. Imagine that you're sitting in a plexiglass enclosure. Is that a particularly appealing thing to go to a restaurant, to go sit in a plexiglass enclosure? Why don't I just stay home? And so, and that's just, that's a personal choice. Yeah. Each of us, we all take risks when you drive in your car, and each of us needs to make our own risk assessment. But it's also, what's the upside? And so for me personally, as much as I like to go out to eat, I also don't mind going to the grocery store and staying at home. And if staying at home means I don't have to live in a plexiglass enclosure, I'm probably going to make that decision. But everybody's going to be different. And again, maybe being outdoors is really fundamental here, and I'd go back out to outdoor dining restaurants as a way of enjoying the hospitality, but also being safe.
Mm-hmm. So, kind of a closing question, but I'll also allow you to give some further closing remarks. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And what gives you hope during these dark times?
Well, I am. I know that, these things can be very negative sounding. I am optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic that we will get through this. We've gotten through these things in the past. We will get through this again. I'm also optimistic that our political parties came together and said that they're going to take bold action to support the economy and the American people and workers and businesses. And I think that's really positive. That was not obvious to me that was going to happen 6 months ago. So that's really positive. And I hope and expect that they will continue to come together to support the American economy. That also gives me hope. So we've gotten through this in the past. We got through the 2008 crisis. We will get through this. The challenge is, how do we get through it and have as few people suffering as a result of it as possible? And what can we do to alleviate their suffering? One of the problems with this crisis is it's disproportionately targeting lower income workers. It's those frontline service workers that cannot work at home the way I'm working at home, the way most of us are working from home. And that's what's really unfair about this. And that's why I'm encouraging our leaders to continue to provide them support so that they can get through this. Nobody's at fault here. This is not the 2008 crisis where people gambled on homes or they gambled on risky mortgages. This is a natural disaster that is hitting the US economy, the world economy at the same time. And the good news also is we have the fiscal capacity to support the American people to get through this natural disaster and then get our economy moving again. So we got a lot of strengths that can get us through this. And I am optimistic. I just want us to be realistic about what it's going to take to get from here to the end of it.
Do you have any parting advice, since everyone sits on a number of boards and we're trying to help advise them as best we can and participate in the conversation about how to really position companies so they don't go under and they don't go through the strife and go through bankruptcy? What advice do you have for all the women listening to you? You have quite a pipeline to be able to shed some light on some critical questions we should be asking.
I think just based on the questions that you all have asked me, you all are focused on all the right issues. I mean, you're asking the right questions, and there's a lot of things that, as I said, I was very honest about what I don't know. There's a lot we don't know. But at the end of the day, you do have to make decisions based on the information that you have available. So keep asking the questions that you're asking. Keep sharing what you're learning. Maintain flexibility so that if new information comes in, remember just a few months ago, the health experts said, don't wear masks. Now it turns out wearing masks are pretty important. So we're getting new information, and we're going to all have to be flexible and adjust. So as you think about the key decisions that your institutions are making, maybe err on the side of adopting those decisions that provide you some flexibility. Don't go all in one way and say, this is just the one direction we're going. And if we go in, we can never pivot from there. You might have to pivot as we get more information. So I think building in some flexibility is probably going to be wise, but I think you all are really capable, and sound, just based on your questions, you really focus on the right issues from my perspective. And so I appreciate the opportunity to chat with all and hear from you today.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to learn from you. Your insights, your candor, and your hard work to really work to stabilize the economy is appreciated by all of us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you. And we will finish and right on time. So thank you so much.